The Baltimore Ravens were in the headlines on Tuesday as Jamal Adams reportedly visited with the team. Are the Ravens tipping their hand at who they want their safety depth to be with the news? We talk about that and so much more coming up next on this episode of Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Allstriker of Ravens Wire, here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. As always, thank you so much for being here, making us a part of your day and your first listen each and every single day. We're free and available on all podcasting platforms and video form on YouTube. If you want to subscribe, like the video, turn notifications on, we have you covered. Also in audio form, if you're an audio listener, be sure to subscribe over there, follow along. 5 days a week, daily Ravens coverage, Monday through Friday, plus bonus content as well. Today's episode of Locked On Ravens is going to be a really, really good one because we have a bunch of things on the horizon today. Big news coming out of the castle yesterday. Adam Schefter reporting former New York Jets safety, Seattle Seahawks safety, Jamal Adams visiting the Ravens. Caused a lot of controversy, let me tell you, on Ravens social media. And I think look, it's the big story of the day we have to talk about. Are the Ravens tipping their hand at who they want as safety depth and what kind of safety depth they're looking for? We're going to be talking about Adams, his career arc. Would he be good for the Ravens? Would he not be? Talk about what he could bring to the table and then what Baltimore really needs at safety. We'll also get into that. So first segment, we'll talk about Adams in general. Second segment, we'll get into a more general view of what Baltimore actually needs at the position. Then we'll get into a couple of Ravens news, notes, and quotes. John Harbaugh opening up some really special things, a special announcement for him on Tuesday. And also Marlon Humphrey, there's a conversation about him that is running rampant on social media, and I might have had something to do with it. So we'll talk about that in the final part of the show. Let's talk about Jamal Adams, though. Interesting. That's what I'll say. I'll say it's interesting. Adams would not be my first or second or third or fourth choice for a safety, especially considering the Ravens need depth. Now, some general background on Jamal Adams, 6th overall pick in 2017 by the Jets. And look, his Jets tenure was incredible. Came in and absolutely balled out. He's been a player that's been uber productive in a bunch of different roles. But the issue is that there have been a bunch of injuries, especially after his Seattle tenure, where it hasn't really panned out for him at the end of the day. Where, look, you can start with his Jets career and even the year in Seattle after he got traded there in 2020. His best year was 9.5 sacks in 2020 with Seattle. That was his last Pro Bowl, All-Pro year, any of those accolades. That was it. 2020, he was a Pro Bowler. 2019, it was a first-team All-Pro. The issue is that literally for Jamal Adams, that was it. He literally has not had a sack in 3 seasons from 2021 to 2023. That was one of Adams and his calling cards, was his ability to be moved all over the field, his ability to blitz. He can lead a team in sacks. I think he literally did lead Seattle in sacks in 2019, or in 2020, excuse me, if I'm not mistaken. But in my opinion, maybe I'm wrong there, but he was up there in terms of team sacks. But he only played in 1 game in 2022, 9 games in 2023. He's only played in 2 full seasons in his NFL career that spans 7 years, and those were the first 2 years of his career. Now, there are pros and cons to if the Ravens make this move. Again, this wouldn't be the move I would personally make, but if we're talking about a reason why the Ravens would bring in Jamal Adams, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the second part of the show, it could be, and this might be a little crazy, as a Patrick Queen replacement. Not a safety depth guy, but as a Patrick Queen guy, where you would still list him as a safety. That would still be his position, and he would still play a bit of that. But with Patrick Queen now gone, the Ravens don't have a necessity to line up 2 inside linebackers every single play like they were doing with Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen. Those 2 were just too good to leave off of the field together, right? You weren't going to take Patrick Queen off for significant snaps, and obviously you're not going to take Roquan off either. But the Ravens, they didn't use a ton of dime packages last season in terms of only leaving 1 inside linebacker on the field and taking the other one off. But now with Patrick Queen gone, Trenton Simpson could be awesome, right? And I'm a big Trenton Simpson believer, but he's not proven yet. For Jamal Adams, this would also give Kyle Hamilton some level of ability to roam, but the issue is that if you want Hamilton to roam, that means Adams has to play in too high if you run those looks, and I'd rather have Hamilton playing too high in that situation. Adams would be your roamer. What the Ravens actually need safety-wise, and I guess we're just going to talk about it now instead of the second segment. We'll still talk about it then, but I think they need someone who has more of the Geno Stone / Marcus Williams skill set. Adams just doesn't have that. That's not his game. You put Adams close to the line, you run him at the quarterback, and he's really good at doing that when he's on. But the other issue here is that Adams and his extensive injury history could be an issue, and we're going over to draftsharks.com. This is what we use for injuries. And for Adams, again, started off, he had an ankle sprain in 2017 in the preseason or like training camp-ish areas, rookie year, so missed a few days of practice. Was relatively healthy until 2020. He strained his groin, finger dislocation, now tore the labrum in his shoulder, tore his quad, concussion, knee strain at the end of last season. So it's you got to probably, we've talked about this with Julio Jones before at the wide receiver position, even Sammy Watkins when the Ravens brought him in. You probably at this point in Jamal Adams' career, you have to at least pencil in, hopefully he plays if he signs with Baltimore or wherever, right? You never wish injuries on anybody, but hopefully he can play a full 17 games this year. But you have to pencil that in just in case. So in my opinion, Baltimore has a lot of different options that they can use in terms of, there are a bunch of free agents out there. We talked about that yesterday, right? In terms of, for the Ravens, they could bring in Justin Simmons or Eddie Jackson or Micah Hyde or one of these other safeties. But I didn't necessarily pinpoint Jamal Adams because when I look at what Baltimore needs, you look more into that, ball hawking situation. But Adams, on the other hand, too, he has had some run-ins with the media. Some of the reports coming out of both New York and Seattle can be a bit of a diva. So in my opinion, if the Ravens feel like he's past all that and everything, then sure, I guess, but it's almost like an increased Odell situation where I think Odell got a bad rep for being a diva and everything, and like that wasn't necessarily fair to be placed on him. Adams, the most recent thing, and I don't know if it was the big one, is he went after a New York reporter's wife because the reporter said something about like yikes or something about something he said, and so Jamal Adams went after the reporter's wife, and that got a ton of backlash. I'm like, is that someone the Ravens want in their locker room? I don't know. This also could be a situation, and we've seen this in the past with Baltimore and them bringing in guys just for visits. We saw this with Des Bryant in 2021, right, where they brought him in, and it essentially was, we want you to be just aware that we're interested, and if we need you, we'll call you. And maybe this is what that was. The Ravens are clearly sniffing around safety depth, as they should be. They desperately need it. At the end of the day, we know that Marcus Williams and Kyle Hamilton are their two guys, but having a 7th-round rookie and an undrafted rookie as your two safety depth pieces, that's not going to cut it. Geno Stone played really well in the absence of Marcus Williams. I've been preaching that forever, and part of the reason why Baltimore's defense was so good last season was because of the fact that they had pretty seamless transitions in their secondary from Williams to Stone and from Marlon Humphrey to Ronald Darby, and they didn't really miss a beat. It wasn't such a severe downgrade for those two where it ended up costing them big plays or games or whatever. So skill set wise, Adams is not what they need at safety. Again, we'll get into that a little bit more in detail in the second part of the show. But if they want to use him as a dime linebacker, put him up at the line, and then on top of that, bring in another guy and then have 5 safeties essentially with maybe a Sanusi Kane or Bo Braid being there as the 5th safety, then that could potentially be an option for them. But at the end of the day, if you're only bringing in Adams, if the Ravens make this move and they only bring in Adams and that's it, and it's Williams, Hamilton, Adams, Kane, and Bo Braid, it doesn't fit what the Ravens would need. Because even if you want to compare injury histories, right? Like Williams has come to Baltimore after some pretty healthy years in New Orleans, and he's missed time with 2 significant injuries in 2 seasons. Hamilton, on the other hand, he had that, what was it, the 49ers here? Was it the Jacksonville game he suffered, an MCL sprain? Almost aggravated it against the 49ers, but he's been relatively healthy, knock on wood, over his first 2 years in the league. So if Williams goes down, it's going to be a little hard to trust Adams and Hamilton in the 2 high because you can't move Hamilton around. You'd have to either trust Sanusi Kane on the back end, trust Bo Braid on the back end. And I feel like if you want to bring in 2 vet safeties, that's totally fine with me. If Adams is one of those to be a dime linebacker hybrid guy, okay, I can live with that. I don't think Adams is a terrible, horrible player, but also at the end of the day, he was in the bottom half of the league. In fact, way, way, way down in terms of missed tackles. And again, the injury history does scare me a little bit. So I don't know if they're going to actually bring him in or not, but it does at least give me a little peace of mind that Baltimore is at the very least sniffing around safety depth. Coming up in the second part of the show, though, we'll get a little more in detail about what Baltimore actually does need at the safety position. So be sure to stay tuned. We have a lot to talk about here on Locked On Ravens. First, the show is brought to you by Yahoo Finance, and I've personally been using Yahoo Finance, who is our sponsor for today, and I've always thought I need to see my retirement accounts, all my investment accounts, everything in one place, right? It can be really tough to go to a bunch of different places, and you have one thing over here, one thing over there, one thing over here. It can just get to be a lot, but Yahoo Finance consolidates all of that into one place, and that makes it super easy for me to manage things. So, for example, 401ks and everything, it's made it super easy for me to navigate. And so I've also wanted to grow my portfolio a bunch as well. Inflation is a huge deal. I personally think about inflation a lot. And with Yahoo Finance, you can actually gain access to the news, data, and tools you need in order to reach that financial freedom. And for me, I've been trying to find that for a very long time. So for more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. And Yahoo is known for so much, but Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data you need in just one place. Again, a real sticking point for Yahoo Finance for me, which I absolutely love. And the community is great. There are 90 million users each month, and their real strength is helping you on your way to financial success. So for comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com, a number one financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. We're back, our second segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still talking with you here on this midweek edition episode. Really appreciate, again, everybody making us a part of your day here on Locked On Ravens. Be sure to subscribe and follow along, video form and audio form. Now, when we talked about biggest needs for the Ravens before the draft, we were obviously going in circles about wide receiver and cornerback and edge, and obviously offensive line being the biggest, knowing they lost 3 starters there. But that's my point, is talk about the offensive line. I know they lost 3 starters, right? Well, that's big, and they addressed that. They brought in Roger Rosengarten. They did draft Nick Samek later, and they also have Josh Jones. Now, I wouldn't be opposed to them adding somebody else there. We talked about that on yesterday's show. So for a more comprehensive, detailed evaluation of any other Ravens post-draft free agent targets, be sure to check out yesterday's show. We talk about stud wide receivers, stud safeties. Jamal Adams, we did not cover in that, but we cover other safeties in there as well. But speaking of, the Ravens, it wasn't just starters they lost on this team, 3 offensive line starters. That's big. But they also lost all their safety depth, literally all of it. And they drafted 1. They brought in an undrafted free agent who was high pedigree, should have been taken probably somewhere on day 3, 5th, 6th, 7th round. But to me, you have to address this somehow. And that's why I said at the end of the first segment, it at least gives me a little peace of mind that the Ravens are going out there and at least looking at some safety depth. But it does bring me to the point we were talking about a tiny bit in that first part of what do they actually need. And my whole point about Kyle Hamilton, and look, Kyle Hamilton is at his best when you can maneuver him all around the field. He's a Swiss Army knife. You can use him up high. You can use him down low. You can use him in the middle of the field. He can cover in the slot. Everything Kyle Hamilton does in that skill set, you want to be able to maximize that. It's actually something the Steelers were going through with Minkah Fitzpatrick, where they just didn't have the safety depth. So they had to use him as a specific role type of guy, where they penciled him in and they had him play one specific role when he's at his best as well, looking and going and doing everything on the field, being that center fielder, guy you can blitz, guy who kind of controls a defense a lot of the time. And they didn't have that ability because of the fact that at the end of the day, they didn't have enough. And so they addressed that. They got a little better in their secondary and they added some pieces. And I think that's going to help Minkah Fitzpatrick. Obviously, they bring in former Raven Deshaun Elliott, and they have other players that can be versatile in that role. But I think the Ravens need to do the same thing for Kyle Hamilton, right? This isn't just about adding safety depth and injury insurance policies. It's about utilizing your players the way that they need to be utilized. And Geno Stone gave them that freedom last season where you could trust him in 2 high with Marcus Williams if you wanted to, and 3 safety looks. I've been preaching forever, right? If you've been with me, if you're an everydayer on the show, first of all, I appreciate you still sticking with me here. But I've been saying back to the Sean Elliott, Chuck Clark, Marcus Williams, all these guys, Hamilton, like we've talked about having good 3 safety rotations. We even talked about it back when Adams was on the trade block, right? We've talked about it with plenty of guests. I've talked about it here solo. 3 safety rotations are the way to go. 3 quality safety rotations. And to me, it feels like if you want to go dime, that's fine. If that is your goal with Jamal Adams and you bring in somebody else who can play that Geno Stone role, then I'm okay with it. That's what I've been saying. But for me, Adams is more a box or even a slot guy, and that is what Kyle Hamilton needs to be able to do. It's essentially you need a guy who can split over the, split safety type guy, right? That's what I mean. Stone was their split safety guy, and he was the 3rd safety. For Jamal Adams, he wouldn't fill that role. If you want Adams as your 4th safety, and then you bring in a Simmons, Eddie Jackson, Micah Hyde, Quandre Diggs, Marcus May even, like those are all guys that fit the Ravens a little bit more, the skill set wise, than what I think Jamal Adams does. Now, he'd be a fun dime backer. The Ravens use Chuck Clark in that role a bunch, but their defense has obviously evolved since Clark ended up leaving, which was only last offseason. But now Zach Orr's defense is going to be a little different, right? You're still retaining the scheme and everything from them hiring internally, but you want to keep a lot of what made it good. And a lot of what made it good, not everything, but a lot of what made it good was being able to utilize Kyle Hamilton in so many other different roles to where he's not just boxed in to one part. We saw him have 3 sacks off the edge in the first half against the Colts in week 3. We saw him patrol the back end with plenty of incredible pass breakups and big momentum swinging plays and breaking up, just everything that he does. You don't want to just limit him. And so you do need safety depth for injuries. I'm worried about the safety depth. If the season started today, that would be the position I'm highlighting. And I'm saying if one of those guys goes down, you're kind of in a bad situation. You're in a world of hurt there if one of Hamilton or Williams goes down. And Hamilton is a big loss in his own right. Obviously, if you bring in Jamal Adams and a safety and Hamilton goes down, or another safety and Hamilton goes down, that's a huge blow to your defense regardless. But if Marcus Williams goes down and you don't have the skill set like Geno Stone to replace him, you might not have as smooth of a transition as you did when you had Geno Stone be able to just pop in there and say, all right, let's do this. And he obviously had a career year in 2023. Adams it's an interesting proposition. I'm pretty shocked the Ravens went for this, honestly, but nothing has happened yet. It at least shows me that they are not done. I never expected them to be. We know Eric Acosta operated so much last season after the draft and figuring out who were these reclamation projects. And that's another thing where if there was a place that could revive Jamal Adams and his career based off the reputation he has now and the years and how his Seattle tenure played out, it probably would be the Ravens in a more limited role. He's not playing as many snaps. You're able to conserve him a little bit, and he's not playing a full workload or anything, but you still are able to use him in more of a role instead of, hey, we're going to do everything with you. You're able to limit his role to a specific thing that he does well within his skill set. Again, probably up the box, dime, blitzing off the edge, blitzing up the middle, something he does very well. And maybe that could be it. But I would still at least want them to prioritize more of a Geno Stone skill set over Jamal Adams. And if they bring in both, then I guess that can be your cherry on the top before the move. So would I do the move personally? No. It's not like I would absolutely hate it if they did it, if they had that role in mind. If they wanted to use him as a split high guy and single high guy, no. And they shouldn't do that. That should be Marcus Williams in his role. But again, hopefully Adams could be a player that could revitalize his career if he is brought in. Coming up, though, we're going to be talking about John Harbaugh, Marlon Humphrey, a lot more. We got some interesting tidbits with them coming up. Stay tuned, plenty to talk about on Locked On Ravens. We're back. Our final segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Allstriker still talking with you here on this Wednesday. As always, really appreciative of all the support here on Locked On Ravens. Be sure to subscribe, follow along video form, audio form for your daily Ravens content. Let's get into John Harbaugh and Marlon Humphrey. Two interesting conversations, two different conversations we'll get to in the final part of the show. Now, first of all, big exciting news for John Harbaugh and his family, launching the Harbaugh Coaching Academy, which is awesome. It was John, his father, Jack, obviously brother, Jim Harbaugh. You got brother-in-law, Tom Crean, who, Indiana and in that head coaching route too. So this is going to benefit all coaches at all levels across all sports as a nonprofit charitable organization. So it's going to be offering tools for youth, high school, college coaches. And that also expands into teachers, instructors, and also parents. So the statement from John Harbaugh saying the Harbaugh Coaching Academy has truly been in development since we were kids. HCA was born out of thousands of coaching lessons learned over the years. It's a culmination of decades of coaching experience, working with coaches and leaders committed to empowering other coaches who aim to have a greater impact on youth performance and well-being, regardless of the sport. So they offer advice, experiences, stories, motivation, methodology, techniques for coaches today, which is a really cool thing. Right? You can feel any type of way you want to feel about John Harbaugh, but I think it's a really cool thing what he's doing. This is going to benefit the community, benefit probably the way coaching is done. I mean, there are a bunch of people who are going to have an impact on this, and the website has a bunch of videos in there from people like Andy Reid, Sean McVay, Tony Dungy, Dick Vermeil, T. Martin. So it's a resource essentially, right? It's a resource which for coaches, sometimes there can be lack of resources and it's hard to kind of get in there, but you get non-confrontational confrontation, safety in football, how to have mental toughness in young athletes, building a staff. So I think it's a really awesome thing. And John Harbaugh, during the unveiling, it was really cool. He had a panel. Tom Crean was in there. Bill Belichick actually showed up to the Ravens facility. He actually told a bunch of stories about his time and his tenure as a coach. And that's probably not done yet. I mean, I think he's taking a year off right now, obviously, but I'm sure he'll be back in it. But he told a lot of interesting stories about his time in New England and obviously other stops along the way. It wasn't just a million for Bill Belichick, but John Harbaugh told a really funny story too about Terrell Suggs, where it was a game against Miami. They were getting on the bus and he ended up not wearing the right shoes. He wore, I think, tennis shoes instead of dress shoes. And this was back when there was strict dress code protocol. And John Harbaugh said, "You're not getting on a plane with those shoes." And so he had somebody from the team go with Suggs back to his house, get the shoes, drive all the way to the airport, and he just barely made it on the plane. It's a really, really funny story. If you haven't seen it, I'll try to get it out on Twitter. I forget who posted it, but obviously it's funny. But for Harbaugh, he's a guy that obviously cares a lot. He's big on family. His family's been very successful at the coaching level. Jack, Jim, John. I mean, it's going to be a great resource, and I'm really excited that he and his family were able to make this a reality. And again, something that he's been dreaming out for a while, according to his statement. So congratulations to John Harbaugh for that. Now, here's the Marlon Humphrey conversation. Bleacher Report put out an article about the most overrated players at each position in the NFL. And for defensive back, their choice was Marlon Humphrey. And essentially what they said was Humphrey could bounce back by staying healthy and locking down wide receivers or pass catchers, but hasn't done both of those in a season for some time. With how much money he's making, that should be an annual occurrence. And I mean, it's true, an annual occurrence, not a rarity. Humphrey, to me, I don't think he's the most overrated defensive back in football. I think that's a little bit of a stretch if we're being honest, but I will admit that the play that he has had, I mean, the injury obviously last year was a disappointment, but he was pretty awesome in 2022. And obviously, in coverage, it's been tough at times for him. And he's had some pretty poor moments, but also he's a versatile player. And I think that he does get a bit of a bad rep, but in what was once probably he was top 5, no question. He's probably moved to me, maybe top 10, top 15. And that's not saying he's a bad player or the most overrated player. I mean, he's making a lot of money. They're going to have a decision to make on his contract. And if he has another poor year this year, there is certainly going to be a case for them to figure things out. And what does his future in Baltimore look like? That was already going to be a pretty big conversation. But to call him the most overrated, again, off the top of my head, I'm just recording this very shortly after I put that out. So I don't have a guy who is in mind for me as most overrated defensive back, but I feel like it's a little bit of a stretch. Like, has he been up to the performance that we've expected him to be? Has he lived up to that? No. I mean, we can all admit that, and that's fine. We're all realists here in terms of when a guy deserves to be criticized, I'll criticize him. When a guy deserves to get praise, I'll praise him. But I still think Humphrey's a good corner in this league. Is he elite, top 5, best in the league? No, he's not that. Again, I think he's more in the top 10, top 15, in my opinion, as opposed to top 5, where I think people had him for a pretty long while before. I just think a couple mediocre years, and then the injury last year caused him to miss a couple games, or injuries, I guess, caused him to miss a couple games. So it was a rough year last year for Marlon. I think a lot of people are expecting a bounce back from him, but I think a bounce back year is definitely needed. I mean, his 2022 was absolutely incredible. And I feel like he's a player that, like, any team would get on their squad as a number one. Only a few select teams wouldn't have him as their number one corner. And that's not to say that he's a guy that is absolved of all criticism. No, nobody is that. Nobody's absolved of all criticism. But I think you feel a lot better with Marlon in your secondary than you don't. And the money he's making is a lot. He has to live up to that expectation this year, or a restructure, or just, the future. They have to figure out his future. But to me, Marlon's a player that you want, and his physicality is great. He still is great in run support, and that's what the Ravens defense is. They want physical guys in their secondary, physical guys on their defense, honestly. They want hitters. They want guys who can go out there and hit, go out there and be physical, and Marlon is that, but the coverage, I mean, based off of 2023, a little more consistent there, but he was awesome, and he's been awesome for a while. The issue is that the consistency has fallen off, where he'll have more bad plays than we're used to seeing, or at least we were used to seeing in the last few seasons for him. So 2023 was rough. 2022 was awesome. I don't agree he's the most overrated defensive back in the league. I think, again, that's a bit of a stretch, but in my opinion, he does need a big year in 2024. That's all I have for you here today on Locked On Ravens, though. Thank you so much for tuning in. Come up tomorrow, more Ravens content. Stay tuned. See you right back here tomorrow on Locked On Ravens.